Hello and welcome to Fast Thinking. I'm Dr. David Bray, inaugural director of the Atlantic Council's Geotech Center. DarkSide's hack of the Colonial Pipeline demonstrated the real-world consequences of ransomware attacks, which in this case included gasoline shortages and spikes all along the eastern seaboard. Yet this hack was just one case in a growing costly ransomware trend. 2 years ago, on average, an organization was targeted for a ransomware attack every 6 minutes. Within 1 year, it was down to just 2 minutes on average. And the costs have been growing as well. For ransomware between 2019 and 2020, the average demand grew exponentially from just under $7,000 US to well over $80,000 US, and the length of business closures nearly tripled. Collectively, these are not good trends for the world. On this episode of Fast Thinking, we're diving past the headlines to address two fundamental questions. Why are ransomware attacks on the rise, and what are the geopolitical consequences of and solutions to growing ransomware attacks? I'd like to welcome friend and colleague Dr. Trey Herr, director of the Atlantic Council's Cyber Statecraft Initiative. Trey, in your opinion, why are ransomware attacks on the rise, and what are geopolitical consequences of them?
It's just too easy. And we talk about the internet, it's evolved over the last 25 years as a tremendous sort of engine of innovation and opportunity for social interaction. It's made the world much smaller, but it's also been a significantly profitable enterprise. That's what's driven the uptake of new technologies, the push for new protocols, and to bring billions and billions of people online. One way to generate those kinds of profits is through cybercrime. Ransomware, this technique of encrypting data on someone else's computer and asking for money to decrypt it, has been incredibly effective for a long period of time. And I think, unfortunately, what we see is it's still just too dang easy for this market to grow and expand. And so while the introduction of more effective multi-factor authentication and better defenses for malware have made it a little bit more costly relative to the benefit that people and organizations and these criminal groups can get from launching ransomware onto these computers, the calculus is way to the offensive side. So I think, unfortunately, what we're seeing is it remains too easy, it remains too profitable, and the incentive to make a buck here is too straightforward to really see anything other than a continued increase. And Colonial, while it's been big and unfortunate, has driven a lot of eyes and attention to the issue. I think it's really just the beginning of the iceberg.
And I'm reminded of when there was another technology breakthrough that happened at the beginning of the 20th century, which was the automobile. And again, like you said, could be used for great things, could be used for interstate commerce, but it also led to interstate crime. And it led to criminal attacks where someone from outside your city or your town could come in, rob a bank, and then keep on going. And so local police would be stymied. And it led to eventually the creation of the FBI and fingerprinting. So I guess, Trey, in your thoughts, do we need something new? Because it seems like a lot of these are transnational in nature. Interpol can only do so much. How do we actually address the cross-jurisdictional issues of this new technology and ransomware?
Yeah, no, and the Bonnie and Clyde example is a really good one for this, right? You get the automobile, you also get armed bank robbers on cars. And as the sophistication of those attacks in law enforcement were continually in tension with each other, it drove innovation on both sides. The jurisdictional challenge is a tricky one. We see a lot of these groups operate out of Eastern Europe, and there's obviously been a lot of attention on this DarkSide organization, which is a franchise model. I think people should understand it's a McDonald's, right? It's basically DarkSide is then selling their basic tools and operating model and customer service techniques to affiliate groups to go and compromise other organizations. But the fact that we have the FBI and Secret Service, which plays a tremendous role in going after these groups in the United States, having to operate across these jurisdictions is tricky. There's been some good work done on the Mutual Legal Assistance Treaty reform process, where the U.S. is often in a challenging position to share or obtain law enforcement data from foreign countries, in part because we're really bad about sharing it ourselves. And there was a push under the late stages of the Obama administration to try and address that and to change that with the Cloud Act. But I think realistically, this is something that has to become a more significant law enforcement priority before we see changes in policy. It requires policy changes and investment before we see sort of real world outcomes. And that could be many years down the line. The other piece to this, I think, to your question on multi-jurisdictionality is that, again, even if we're able to catch and prosecute these sorts of affiliates more effectively, if we're not targeting and making it a sort of persistent priority to target the central franchise owners, then this is going to keep happening. That transaction cost of renting a ransomware kit, again, it's pretty low. It's pretty straightforward. So part of our thinking also has to be not just in where we're looking, but how we're targeting these groups and trying to find and fix and actually eliminate those sort of central nodes in the network. That's my take on it. But I'm curious about this for you. I think you guys have seen some really interesting research on the growing scale and scourge of ransomware. What's your sense of part of what's driving that change?
Yes, I think like I said, and partly it's just too easy to do. It's partly that TCP/IP was not built in mind of deflecting this. And like you said, it's a 5-mile or 50-mile goalpost, and all they have to do is kick it in somewhere. I do also think it's partly that we have a responsibility on the organizational side to present not just a minimized attack surface, but a rapidly changing attack surface. I mean, I use the analogy, and it was actually a pitch that I made back to XPRIZE back at the beginning of the 2010 period, was could we have an XPRIZE where you could have college kids, high school kids, anyone, I really don't care, but anyone who's interested in coming together as a team plus bots to actually sight unseen recover from some event. Could be ransomware, could be something like that, in less than 24 hours. And so that would require them to actually develop the analytical toolkits to come in and assess the damage that's done to an infrastructure, recover from it very quickly. And then similarly, have the other end, which would be develop the competition to have teams of people that can actually change a cyber obstacle course in less than 24 hours. As you know, Trey, I mean, the Department of Defense has some, others have cyber obstacle courses or cyber ranges, but they take a long time to set up. And the goal is just like how we did the autonomous car, and that took, when the first autonomous car competition was done by DARPA and others, it didn't get past like about 50 feet. But over time, it actually got that the car could actually drive the obstacle course itself. What I want to see is, can we bounce back from a really bad cyber event, whether it's ransomware or some other attack, in less than 24 hours through a combination of human and machine teaming? And then similarly, the other side would be, can we create a new cyber obstacle course every 24 hours? Because the way I think about it is, organizations don't change their infrastructure on a regular basis. So it's really easy to reconnoiter an attack and put it in, and then don't be surprised they take advantage. So I guess I'd be interested in your ideas about that idea of like what we would call adaptive sort of organizational defenses as a way to actually stymie some of the ransomware that's out there.
Yeah, and there's been really good work on the notion of deception within networks. The idea that as a defender, because you control the environment, you should be in a position to change its shape, its composition, the names of computers, the organizing system for any kind of telemetry or logs that you take off machines. The fact that the adversary has to learn so much about your network to be able to gain access to it effectively in most cases gives you some advantage there. For me, it resonates, this notion of the cyber poverty line that Wendy Nather at Cisco and others have talked about, where it's fine for us to have good approaches and interesting solutions to these technical challenges, but the bulk of these victims are low capacity organizations that may not have full-time IT staff, that are just trying to get basic functionality up and keep it running. And so, where are there opportunities to take this idea of the obstacle course or deception and pull that to its basest elements as something that we can package and share with an organization that, has a backup and has a volunteer sysadmin once a week, right? And has the capacity to change one thing a month of any kind of consequence technically. And I think that's been a significant challenge here. And it's the targets that you see in many cases. They're regional hospitals, they're cities with a relatively immature IT infrastructure. It's small manufacturing companies. And that is the sort of ugly flip side of ransomware, is it targets the least capable in many cases among us, not to exclusion of of large targets like Colonial. But it really victimizes populations that are least capable of defending against it in any sort of highly mature fashion. We see ransomware impact not just Fortune 500 companies, but also small startups, also these sort of medium-sized manufacturing companies. What does that say about the notion of technology for good or ill, and the ability to continue to see innovation from those sectors in the future? Are we imperiling the seed corn of American innovation?
Oh, you're spot on. And then what we say at the Geotech Center, and we try to emphasize to people, is the good news is technology is getting democratized. The challenging news is technology is getting democratized. And so, just as everyone will either use it for good purposes or mundane purposes like cat videos, don't be surprised that some people also use it to do ransomware. And I think it actually points to, you're spot on about needing to think about solutions that are effective for those that are startups or small businesses that cannot afford to do a lot of investment. Because if they're susceptible to ransomware, that means they're also susceptible to even more sophisticated attacks by nation state actors. And then you worry about, does intellectual property walk out the door? If you're a startup that's got a really great idea, you're rushing forward, maybe you get approached by some interesting countries, but you say, no, I want to stay in the United States and I want to keep my intellectual property here. But then if those countries have ways of actually doing a very sophisticated attack and your IP walks out the door, startups can't really afford the robust security at their early stage. And so this does point to two things, which is we may need to have minimized attack service as a service. That's probably an awful acronym, but the idea that it needs to be something that can be provided by the experts at a price that's affordable by small businesses, by startups, and maybe we even need to have possibly government encouragement that this is provided to small businesses and startups. Otherwise, don't be surprised if 10 years from now, we see even more intellectual property leaving the United States because we're at risk. Do we need to have, because government should lead the way in this space, and that government really shouldn't be producing its own desktop images and its own desktop software. And so could it be that we could turn to industry partners and say, look, we want to separate our data from our operating environment so that if the operating environment does get compromised, all we have to do is collapse it, build back up very quickly. And we know that's done by certain cloud companies to actually keep their servers robust. Could government lead the way by having competitions that say, we want to get to a price point where desktop as a service is something that's provided not just for the federal government, but for state and locals. And then that could be something that could actually become available for the hospitals, the libraries, the banks, and others.
Yeah, I mean, it just answers at different levels, right? At the end of the day, the fact that data and programs are indistinguishable, it's baked into the architecture from the 40s, right? That's the von Neumann notion of computing that we've been forever blessed and cursed with. So it's hard to isolate this from each other. The notion that you're talking about, logical isolation, is something that's done well in cloud environments where I can take my operating system and segment out from it, right, or separate from it any sort of useful user data. But it entails a change in thinking and design philosophy, and in some cases, some very uncomfortable conversations about data ownership and portability. I'm encouraged by the amount of attention that Colonial has drawn to this issue and the fact that it does have this sort of geopolitical hook in this, pocketbook piece with gas prices. I think it's possible that we'll start to see more energy in solutions around what is trying to address cybercrime, right, in a very conventional model of it. But that those might also bleed into technical changes, might also bleed into incentive changes as well. But I think, unfortunately, you and I are going to be having this conversation a lot over the next few years. So we'll see. Fingers crossed.
Thank you, Trey, for everything that you and your Cyber Statecraft Initiative are doing. For all our listeners, as we say at the Atlantic Council, please be bold, please be brave, and benevolent for the future ahead.